What do we call those who have wiped out an entire nation in today's world? What do we call the act of invading someone's land and massacring peaceful people? Let's search for the answer in the history of the indigenous tribes that were eradicated by Europeans. The devilish and treacherous Christopher Columbus, who set foot on our lands and guided the colonizers. The European rulers, unable to expand further, fearing the Ottoman Empire, brought their starving people to the American lands, and thus people who had seen nothing but oppression and servitude for centuries arrived, and began to plunder the peaceful native tribes. If the natives refused to give, they took by force. They killed, spread diseases, and starved them to death. In these dark times, entire tribes vanished from the face of the earth. European colonization and the extinct native tribes. One of the darkest chapters in history is the tragedy of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. For thousands of years, they lived freely on their land, in harmony with nature, preserving their traditions and passing them down through generations. But one day, ships with sails appeared on the horizon. This was the beginning of the end. An insatiable greed for new lands, a thirst for power and wealth drove Europeans to these shores. They considered themselves civilized and called the natives savages. But who were the real savages? Those who came with swords, fire, and gunpowder, mercilessly exterminating peaceful people. Taino, the lost people of the Caribbean. Location: Caribbean islands, Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. Causes of extinction. In 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the ocean and made first contact with this people. For the Taino, it was the beginning of a tragedy. The Spaniards, whom the Taino welcomed warmly, turned out to be ruthless oppressors. The men were forced to mine gold and silver, while women and children became slaves, deprived of their freedom. Those who could not endure the hard labor perished from hunger. But that was not all. Europeans brought deadly diseases with them: smallpox, measles, flu. The Taino warriors tried to defend their sacred land, but firearms crushed their resistance. By the 1600s, this civilization was completely wiped out. Interesting fact: the words canoe, barbecue, and hammer come from the Taino language. That is all that remains of a once great people. To Beothuk, the lost people of Canada. Location: Newfoundland Island, Canada. Causes of extinction. The Beothuk lived along the seashore, hunting and fishing, existing in perfect harmony with nature. However, in the 16th and 17th centuries, European fishermen began settling on their lands. For the Beothuk, nature was their mother, rivers were their lifeblood, and forests were their soul. But Europeans saw these lands only as a source of resources. They had no intention of sharing them with the native inhabitants. The Beothuk were driven out, hunted down, and slaughtered like animals. One by one, they fell victim to persecution, starvation, and the diseases brought by Europeans. Eventually, in 1829, the last known Beothuk woman, Shanna Diffit, died. Before her death, she tried to record the history and traditions of her people, hoping to preserve their memory. But for whom? There were no Beothuk left to read it. Interesting fact: the Beothuk painted their deceased with red ochre before burial, which led to the name Red Indians. Now, that red symbolizes blood and tears.
Yuki, the erased tribe of California. Location: Northern California. Causes of extinction. In the 1800s, gold prospectors flooded into California. Blinded by their hunger for wealth, they saw nothing else. But there was one problem: the land they sought belonged to the Yuki people. The Yuki had lived here peacefully for centuries. But for the gold miners, they were an obstacle. The massacre began. The Yuki's bows and spears were no match for European guns and cannons. Starvation, disease, and enslavement wiped them out. By the 1910s, they had virtually ceased to exist. Now, they live only in historical records, in fading pages of forgotten documents. Interesting fact: the Yuki had a unique mathematical system, using a base 8 counting method instead of base 10. But even numbers could not change their fate. 1. Palomar, the forgotten people of the US-Mexico border. Location: the border between California and Mexico. Causes of extinction: Spanish missionaries forced the Palomar people to convert to Catholicism. They were made to abandon their beliefs, their land, and their freedom. The Spanish colonial system enslaved the Palomar people. They were subjected to harsh labor. Their women and daughters faced abuse, and their children were taken from them. By the 19th century, the last remnants of this people had vanished. Their names, customs, stories, and songs were buried with them. This is just a glimpse of the countless tragedies that befell indigenous peoples. Hundreds, thousands of tribes suffered similar fates. They became mere footnotes in history. Europeans saw themselves as the rightful owners of these lands. But in reality, they only brought death. We have no right to forget this history. Because with every lost people, an entire world disappears. Only by remembering them can